evening, everybody. Welcome aboard. For those of you who are watching along on Facebook, you can comment or ask questions in the comment section, and I will try to turn my attention there as frequently as I possibly can. Okay. We're entering into a subject which, above and beyond its general importance, it has a certain ring in particularly desperate times. It has a certain ring and attraction for us. And that's the subject of Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah, a messianic age, the full flowering of the Jewish people, the conclusion of history, if you will, the messianic age is really been thrust into primacy, especially in the last couple of decades in particular. And most of the credit for pushing the Messianic age into common sort of constant consciousness is probably Chabad Lubavitch and their enthusiasm, not only for the concept of Mashiach, but for many of them, the impersonation of the Mashiach in the person of Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay. We're going to look at some sources. And in particular, we're going to be taking a look at Rambam, at Maimonides. And the reason why we want to look at Maimonides is because Maimonides, as opposed to many of your other potential sources for taking a look at questions of the Messiah, Maimonides is, first of all, very succinct. But second of all, Maimonides is very much, if you will, has his feet on the ground when it comes to these questions. Maimonides wants to proceed in a very sort of halachic, very, very cut and dry way to understand or to talk about the Messianic era. And he does that actually in his legal code. The very last chapters in his legal code talk about the Messiah. Who the Messiah is, what the Messiah will do, what will the Messianic age be like. The last two chapters of his magnum opus of the Mishnah Torah, that's what it discusses. We're going to take a look at both selections from both of those chapters over the course of at least the next 2 and possibly 3 weeks. But this evening, I'm going to start you out with a selection not from the next to last chapter, chapter 12, but actually the beginning of chapter 13. And there is a method to the madness, of course. And in the beginning of chapter 13, as we'll see momentarily, and I'll show you on your screens, at the beginning of chapter 13, Maimonides discusses what will the Messianic era look like. Now let's take a second, you and I, just for our own thought. Do you ever wonder, like, what's that going to look like? Exactly what's that going to look like? What will the Messianic age on the ground, practically, what does that mean? Does it mean that, there'll be a perfection of the world? Does it mean that the Jewish people are going to rule the world? What does that mean, practically and on the ground? Maimonides deals with exactly this question. Maimonides wants to know, okay, what is it going to be like? How do I know who the Messiah is? Give it to me cut and dry. He's going to present it to us. And he's got a very particular approach. And what we're going to come to study is that Maimonides' approach, his very particular approach, is actually driven by his being trapped in a little bit of an historical question. But that we'll get to soon enough. Okay, let's turn our attention. I'm going to take me a moment here probably to get this right. But I'm going to share a screen with you. There we go. And then we want to go to Google Chrome. Maybe this. It's this or the other one. Let's see. Share. Okay, that's good. And we want to share this tab. Here we go. Chapter 12. I think I said 12 and 13 before. I should have said 11 and 12. So this is chapter 12. Of the Mishnah Torah. You can see it up here, drawn from the website Sefaria, which is an endless source of material in both Hebrew and English, material for study. So I recommend that to anybody. You can just look it up at sefaria.org. So this is from the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides' halachic work, Kings and Wars, chapter 12. All right. I'm going to stick to the English text in particular because we got a little bit of text to cover here. So let me just switch back over to here. And
I
let's see
can't
if I
hear
can make
the
it a little
screen.
larger. I'm surprised. Here we go. Here we go. We're making progress. We want to make this bigger. Here we go.
Let me leave and then
We're
I'll go
reading
back
right here in
on.
the gray box. It should not occur to you that during the days of the Messiah, a single thing from the ways of the world will be canceled, nor will there be something novel in creation. Rather, the world will continue in its customary way. Okay, the idea that somehow the Messiah is going to come and global warming is going to be solved, it's not really how it's going to work. Okay, the reality is that when the Messiah comes, we're still going to need gasoline in our cars. The world's just going to continue to function the way it is. Now, why would I think otherwise anyway? Oh, well, that's because the prophets are filled. Maimonides will give us a few examples. The prophets are filled with statements that would appear to say that the very nature of the world will have changed. Right? Now, we're on the fourth line here. Now, that which is said in Isaiah, and the wolf will live with the sheep, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, is a parable and riddle. The substance of the matter is that Israel will dwell in safety with the wicked of the world, who are compared to wolves and tigers. As it is said, a wolf of the desert spoils them, a leopard watch over their city. Okay? What Maimonides is saying is, listen, that verse from Isaiah, it's a parable. Let's go further. We really have to cover a little bit more ground here, and we'll appreciate Maimonides' approach a little more. But they will all return to the true religion. Right? All the non-Jews of the world will return to the true religion. This is a longer subject than for today, but that doesn't mean Judaism. It means ethical monotheism and what we call the 7 Noahide laws. Longer discussion. And they will not steal and not destroy. Rather, they will eat of the permissible foods comfortably, like Israel. As it says, and the lion will eat straw as does the ox. And so similar matters written about the Messiah are parables. Listen, Maimonides is saying you might see a lot of stuff about the Messiah and the prophets. If it doesn't seem to match up with the way the world works, don't worry about it. It's just a parable. He's sort of explaining anything supernatural that's foretold about the Messianic era. He's wiping away. This, by the way, is typical Maimonides. Anyway, Maimonides is not a fan of miracles and of changing the world order, but we're not going to analyze that right now. We're going to take a different approach in understanding Maimonides here. Just finishing out here, and so similar matters written about the Messiah are parables. In the days of the King Messiah, everyone will understand these parables and to what these matters were compared and to what was hinted. Basically, if you read stuff and it doesn't make sense to you because that's not the way the world works, when the Messianic age comes and we all get to experience the Messianic age, we'll understand what all of that meant. Don't worry about that now, says Maimonides. All that supernatural Messianic stuff, don't worry about that now. You'll understand that later. Okay? We'll go on Maimonides' authority on that. Let's take a look at law number 2 in this chapter. Our sages have said that there is no difference between this world and the days of the Messiah except our subservience to the kingdoms of the world alone. That means that the Jews will be able to live in peace. Nobody's going to bother us. From the plain meaning of the words of the prophets, we understand that at the beginning of the days, now note from the plain meaning of the words of the prophets, we understand that at the beginning of the days of the Messiah, there will be a war of Gog and Magog. I have to refer you to the prophets for more information about that. Before the war of Gog and Magog, a prophet will arise to correct Israel and prepare their hearts. As it says, behold, I will send you Elijah from the prophet Malachi. So you're going to have a Messianic era. Before the Messianic era happens, you're going to have this war of Gog and Magog. And before that happens, somebody's going to come and like bring the Jewish people around somehow. Elijah or some prophet. A prophet will arise. Maimonides isn't saying Elijah will return. He's just saying a prophet will arise who could be compared to Elijah. Now, keep in mind that whoever this is, he will not come to make the pure impure, nor purify the impure, nor disqualify people who are presumed to have legitimate lineage, nor qualify those who are disqualified. He will only come to bring peace to the world. As it is said, he shall turn the hearts of the fathers on their children. Maimonides is hinting here at something very important. One of the things that's expected in the Messianic era is that the Messiah will decide certain halachic questions, certain questions of Jewish law. So Maimonides is being very clear here that this person who comes before the Messianic era, he's not interested in making any of these halachic determinations that later on the Messiah will make. He's not interested in doing that. Some of the sages say that Elijah will come before the coming of the Messiah. Elijah in particular. So Maimonides sort of throwing out, some say this, some say that. Now, I got to tell you, Maimonides and some say this, some say that is a very strange thing. Maimonides' hallmark is being decisive. Usually he just tells you this is the way it is. But Maimonides is being very, very careful when it comes to the Messianic era and to the Messiah issue to point out that nobody really knows exactly what's going on. And I'll show it to you in his words. Okay. But regarding all these matters and similar, no one knows how it will be until it will be. Maimonides is saying we just don't know. Let's continue. Let's take that a little bit deeper. For these matters were unclear to the prophets. Even the sages themselves did not have a tradition regarding these matters and could only attempt to understand the verses. Thus, there were disagreements in these matters. Okay? Maimonides making a big statement here. Nobody ever really knew for sure. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. It's a pretty amazing statement. There's no tradition about it. It's not like it was told to Moses at Sinai or Jacob told his children or there's some secret something somewhere. Nope, none of that. Maimonides is saying, listen, again, I love this sentence. No one knows how it will be until it will be. So for what we know, we don't really know all that much. Let me just continue to the bottom of this paragraph and then I'll try to frame it a little bit more. Even the sages, thus, there were disagreements in these matters. Nevertheless, Maimonides says, neither the order that these events will occur, nor their details are fundamental to the religion. Neither the order that these will occur or the details are fundamental to the religion. Right? What's fundamental to the religion is there's going to be a Messiah. The rest of the stuff is not fundamental. At the end of the day, does it really matter exactly how it's going to go down? Right? Because after all, Maimonides says, nobody really knows what most of those things mean. Thus, continues Maimonides, a person must never busy himself with the Agadas. Agadas are material in the Talmud that is not halachic material and often interprets verses in fantastical ways. And not dwell on the Midrashim regarding these matters or similar issues. He must not make them dogma. That's a big word for Maimonides. You can't make it dogma how it's going to go down. It is dogma, as is clear from Maimonides' 12th principle of his 13 principles. It is dogma that there will be a Messiah. But, 12? Yeah, it was 12. But at the same time, how it's going to go down is not dogma. For these do not result in either love nor fear. Okay, now I'll tell you that what's in the parentheses here, I disagree with fear of sin. But for Maimonides says, listen, there are only two categories of things that are really valuable. Things that lead to love of God, which is basically an intellectual apprehension for Maimonides, or it leads to an awesome sense, a sense of the awesomeness of God. That's what's meant by fear here. You look at the world, you see how awesome, oh, wow, God is so awesome. So it's either love of God or fear of God. Maimonides says, listen, none of this messianic stuff, this isn't going to get anybody anywhere. Similarly, one should not calculate the ends. One shouldn't sit and try to figure out riddles. When will the Messiah come? Which, by the way, happens to be that many Kabbalists did. Many people did. They in more closed ways, tried to figure out, kind of in secret ways, when the Messiah would come. Our sages have said that the spirit of those who calculate the ends will expire. Rather, one is to simply wait and believe in the principle of this matter as we have explained. Okay. Maimonides is saying as follows. Look, the world's not going to change. Nothing's going to change in the world. And I can't really explain what all these verses mean that seem to say it's going to change in the world. Can't explain them. We'll figure that out when it happens. For that matter, I can't tell you exactly. There are things that applies. Elijah will come. This will happen. That'll happen. There'll be a war. They say there'll be a war. Maybe there will be. I don't know, says Maimonides. Nobody knows. Just believe that there's going to be a messianic age. Just lock in on that thought. Don't worry about the details. In so many ways, this is not typically Maimonides. Maimonides, throughout the Code of Jewish Law, goes to great pains not to tell you that there are arguments about anything, Maimonides just lays out for you in the Code of Jewish Law, and this is part of the Code of Jewish Law. He says this is the way it is. Clarity and succinctness are the hallmark of what Maimonides does. And yet here we see Maimonides kind of waffling around a little bit. Listen, you want to take a position. I understand you take a position that nothing in the world is going to change. Okay, nothing in the world is going to change and everything else is parables, even though the verses seem to say otherwise, but you want to make them parables, you make them parables. I would consider that a minor question. But to start to say, well, we don't know. There might be a war. There might not be a war. A prophet will come. It might be Elijah. It might not be Elijah. Don't worry. My mind says, don't worry about any of this stuff. Forget this stuff. Forget this stuff. Don't worry about it. Just the Messiah is coming. So I'd like to propose to you this evening, why Maimonides, sort of jumping through hoops here and being as waffling as he is on so many of these issues. And to do that, we have to back up to the previous chapter, which is why I didn't start there. So I'm backing you up here to the previous chapter where Maimonides begins to talk about the Messiah. And get ready, folks, because if you think that this means that you're going to fly to Israel and hang out and do whatever you want because it's a messianic age, that's not quite the way Maimonides lays it out. Let's take a look. The King Messiah. By the way, just a quick note, the word Messiah is a bad transliteration of Mashiach. It's actually not a bad translation. The H should have a dot under it, which makes a ch sound, so it's Messiah. So it's not terribly off, but anyway, Messiah just means somebody who's anointed. It doesn't necessarily refer to the big guy at the end of the days, although that is generally who Maimonides is talking about. But as we'll see, it's not the only Messiah. The King Messiah will arise and reestablish the monarchy of David as it was in former times. Sounds great. He will build the sanctuary and gather in the dispersed of Israel. Building the sanctuary will be a little bit of a challenge, right? But okay, great. All the earlier statutes will be restored as they once were. Sacrifices will be offered. The sabbatical and jubilee years will be observed as commanded in the Torah. Maimonides says Jewish law will rule in the land of Israel. It's going to be a Jewish legal state. There's going to be a sanctuary. Lots of people are going to come. And all the earlier statutes will be restored. And everybody's going to do the right thing. Anyone who does not believe in him, nor one who doesn't anticipate, we're going to skip that because we all believe in him, or at least that's our premise for the class. Let me see here. I'm sorry. These matters are explicit in the Torah and include everything said by all the prophets. It is even written in the chapter of Bilam that's in the Torah, who prophesied about both the Messiahs. The first Messiah was David, who saved Israel from her adversaries. Okay? So you can see right now that Mashiach is not a term that's exclusive to the guy at the end of days. The first anointed one in the line was King David. The final Messiah will be from his sons and will deliver Israel from the hands of the descendants of Esau. Okay? There it says, and we have different verses that say it. Very good. We're going to skip all these verses right there. So what's going to happen? The Messiah is going to come. He's going to reestablish the monarchy. He's going to establish a halachic state with a Beis Hamikdash, and there'll be korbanos, and there'll be Yovel and Shemitah. Beautiful, beautiful. Let's take a look at the next paragraph. Now he brings an interesting proof. I'm tempted to dwell on this, but I won't. But it's an interesting proof that there's going to be a messianic age, because the Torah says, even in the section regarding the cities of refuge, it says, if the Lord your God shall enlarge your borders and shall add for you another 3 cities more. So there were 6 cities of refuge, 3 on one side of the Jordan, 3 on the other side of the Jordan. And the Torah says, if your boundaries increase even more, then there'll be 9 cities. Okay, cities 7 through 9 never happened. Why? It says cities 7 through 9 is in the messianic age. Maimonides is trying to marshal proofs here that there is such a thing as the Messiah. We're going to give him credit that he has proved his point. Okay, now we get to the meat of the matter. Okay, it should not occur to you that the King Messiah must bring wondrous signs or perform marvels or invent new things or revive the dead or anything like what the fools say. It is not so. For Rabbi Akiva, one of the wisest of the sages of Mishnah, was King Ben Kosiba's arms bearer and said that he meaning Bar Kosiba, which is Bar Kokhba, Ben Kosiba and Bar Kokhba are the same guy, said, Ben Kosiba is actually his real name, and said that he was the King Messiah. He and all the sages of his generation thought that he was the King Messiah until he was killed because of his sins. Since he was killed, they then understood that he was not the one. The sages never asked of him neither a sign nor a wonder. So the essence of the matter is like this: the laws and the statutes of the Torah never change. We may not add to them nor detract from them. Anyone who adds or subtracts from them or reveals some new dimension to the Torah understanding of the commandments different than their plain meaning is for sure an evil person and not Bikoros. All Maimonides is saying here at the end is anybody who tells you the Messiah is going to change any of Jewish law, it's not true. We know that. Why? Because nothing happened. Bar Kosiba, they didn't change. Bar Kokhba, they didn't change anything. They thought he was the Mashiach. Nobody was changing anything. All right. Let's pause here. So first of all, if anybody, let me get into a different display here so I can see everybody. And drag you over here and see. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we dig into this a little bit further? That's cool. Okay. Checking over on Facebook. All right. Maimonides' approach to the Messiah is complicated significantly by the fact that there was a Messiah once before, someone who is declared to be the Messiah by the leading rabbis of his day. And if he can be declared Messiah, it must be that only the circumstances which he brought about are necessary to be declared the Messiah. In the end, he wasn't the Messiah. He died because of his sins, whatever. But the bottom line is he was declared Messiah, which means that only the circumstances which were in place when he was declared Messiah, that's the only thing you really need. Right? Otherwise, they could, right? It's got to be, because otherwise they couldn't declare him to be the Messiah. Right? And all this other stuff, therefore, like, no, wait, the lioness lie down with the lamb. We have to see a change in nature. You don't see a change in nature. Nobody saw a change in nature by Bar Kokhba, right? Or there are going to be great wonders in the sky, or the Mashiach is going to do miracles. Bar Kokhba didn't do any of those things. So therefore, for Rambam, if Bar Kokhba didn't do them, you don't have to do them to be the Messiah. Because of that, because Bar Kokhba was declared the Messiah by the halachic aristocracy of his time, Maimonides is pretty much forced to say that only those things which qualified Bar Kokhba are required. Everything else, I don't know what it means. I don't know. We'll find out later. Later on, we'll find out. Which leads us to the question or the concern, or I should say an analysis. It leads us to have to analyze, what is it that Bar Kokhba did? And I want to call your attention here to something very, very profound. Let's start with what we know he did just from the history books. Bar Kokhba's rebellion was a very, very successful rebellion, 132 to 135. I'm almost positive I have those dates correct, yes. It was a very successful rebellion against Rome. And there was an autonomous Jewish state for almost 3 years in the land of Israel. Eventually, the Romans came and with great, great difficulty put down the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Okay, and unfortunately, it was quite a wholesale slaughter and was really the end of vibrant Jewish life in the land of Israel until the modern era. That's the story of Bar Kokhba. Take a look again now at what Maimonides says the Messiah must do. the king Messiah will arise and reestablish the monarchy of David as it was in former times. He certainly did that. Not a question. They were the independent rulers of the land of Israel. They minted their own coins. They had a state. So you could easily go with that. He will build the sanctuary. That's interesting. And gather in the dispersed of Israel. Okay, dispersed of Israel, people come from all sorts of different places to join the effort, which is in fact something that happened. All the earlier statutes will be restored as they once were. Now that would imply that at the time of Bar Kokhba, it was a halachic state. Because remember, anything on this list has to be something that led the rabbis to believe that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach. Because it is the qualifying list for all future candidates as well. In which case it is very, very interesting that Maimonides says that the sanctuary will be rebuilt and sacrifices will be offered. Generally speaking, historically, it's, I would say not generally thought of in the populace anyway. There were two temples. The second temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. There was never a third temple. We look forward, right? We look forward to the third temple, the third temple, the third temple. And interestingly here, Maimonides seems to be implying that we might have missed something. And in fact, Maimonides is right. There's a great book by a Rabbi Resnick. I believe he's local. I believe he's from Muncie, actually. But he's something of an archaeologist and a rabbinic scholar. And it's called The Third Temple Revisited. And in this book, he shows with what I would say is overwhelming evidence that during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the platform of a temple was reestablished, and at the very least, the Korban Pesach, which did not require many of the other things that other sacrifices would, the Korban Pesach was offered up in the time of Bar Kokhba. There's a great deal of evidence to support this, not the least of which is that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel describes being at a Korban Pesach. And if you go back to from the dating of what's laid out there and when he lived, it couldn't be that he participated in a Korban Pesach at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. It would have made him 175 years old. It just doesn't work. The only way it works is that he was a mature adult. It was a man who was in his 50s or 60s at the time of Bar Kokhba. Also, Rabbi Resnick clearly points out that when the Dome of the Rock sits on a platform. The platform was already there. When the church, and later on they built a mosque there, they built a mosque on the site, the platform was already there. And if you measure out the platform, it actually measures out with a very significant degree of accuracy to the platform that is described for I believe by Ezekiel, for the third temple. So we have a great deal of evidence that Bar Kokhba, one other very important piece of evidence. He has coins. He had coins minted, which had the two pillars of the entrance, Yochid and Boaz. The two pillars at the entrance of the sanctuary were on one side, and he definitely appointed a Kohen Gadol. Something that not sure why you would be appointing a Kohen Gadol if you had no sacrifices. So when we read through Maimonides here, and again, the key to this is to see that Maimonides here is, I don't want to say trapped, he's boxed into a corner. Maimonides is boxed into a corner because if the halachic elite of the time said he was the Mashiach, he must have met the qualifications. That means on the one hand that the other qualifications don't matter, as Maimonides says in chapter 12, the other qualifications don't matter. But on the other hand, it also means that anything that Maimonides lists that the Messiah must do, Bar Kokhba did. And again, we point out that building the sanctuary and sacrifices being offered would have to fit into that. And we've shown some evidence, although I've done classes on this before. I have recordings of it. Maybe I'll do it again because it's so fascinating on the evidence for the fact that Bar Kokhba had a third temple, which would fit obviously very nicely here with Maimonides. Let me take a moment here. Look over at Facebook. Look over here. make sure I'm seeing everybody actually, so I can see if there's anybody who wants to chime in. Please feel free to do so. Wonderful. Okay. Just returning to, let's read through now with this perspective. Let's read through Halacha Gimel again, the third halacha here in chapter 11. It should not occur to you that the King Messiah must bring wondrous signs or perform marvels or invent new things or revive the dead or anything like what the fools say. It is not so, for Rabbi Akiva, one of the wisest of the sages of the Mishnah, was Ben Kosiba's arms bearer and said that he was the King Messiah. He and all the sages of his generation thought that he was the King Messiah until he was killed because of his sins. Since he was killed, they then understood that he was not the one. Wink, wink, right? If the Messiah is killed, he can't be the one. A little offhanded swipe, if you will, at the claims of Christianity. The sages never asked of him neither a sign nor a wonder. So the essence of the matter is like this: the laws and the statutes of the Torah never change, etc., etc. Okay? Maimonides clearly very dependent upon Rabbi Akiva for any level, for his understanding of what's required for the Messiah, and therefore to a large degree what the Messianic age will look like. And now Maimonides wraps up. Now, if a king should arise from the house of David, who is versed in Torah and engages in commandments, as did David his forefather in accordance with both the written and the oral Torahs, and he enjoins all of Israel to follow in its ways and encourages them to repair its breaches, and he fights the wars of God, then he may be presumed to be the Messiah. Presumed. Explain that in a second. If he succeeds in his efforts and defeats the enemies around and builds the sanctuary in its proper place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely the Messiah. Maimonides now introduces a staged concept. There's stage one and stage two. Stage one results in, listen, if he's observant of the Torah and he gets everybody else to be observant of the Torah and he fights the wars of God, whatever that means for the moment, he can be presumed to be the Messiah. Let me show you here, this is important. I'm pointing now with my pointer, which I'm assuming you can see, to the Hebrew. If he does all these things, harei zeh bechezkas shehu Mashiach. Now that word is important. That's the halachic technical word. Bechezkas shehu Mashiach. When something has a chazakah, you have the right to assume it is what it is, even though you're not certain, you have to halachically treat it in a certain way. So for example, a chazakah is somebody squatting on somebody else's property. Once they're squatting there for a certain amount of time, they have what's known as a chazakah. Chazakah basically means that the status quo has changed. It's a certain change in status quo. So for somebody here, this king who's going to arise and bring everybody back to the Jewish people, his status has changed. He is now assumed. He has a chazakah to be the Mashiach. He doesn't have certainty. We're not certain that he's the Mashiach, but for all intent and purposes, as we function halachically in Jewish law, he has a chazakah. He has a chazakah that he's the Mashiach. You're allowed to treat him like the Mashiach and assume he's the Mashiach, but only when, and now we continue, although this is in parentheses, which is always kind of tricky, but it's not treated that way. Scholarly wise, it's assumed to be his. Okay. Now, if he does all these things successfully, and he builds the temple where it should be built, and he brings in the dispersed of Israel, then you know for sure he's Mashiach. Okay. And the Yitakin is Olam Kulo, Lavodos Hashem, he's going to get everybody to serve God. If he succeeds in his efforts to defeat his enemies around his sanctuary, he is definitely the Messiah. Okay. Again, here, we see another reflection of what we've been talking about. See, Maimonides has another problem. He has to explain how Rabbi Akiva got it wrong. That's a big problem. This is a big problem. Right? Rabbi Akiva and the leading sages of his day said he was the Mashiach. How'd they get it wrong? So Maimonides says, well, there's really two stages. If a king should arise from the house of David, who is versed in Torah and engages in commandments, which Bar Kokhba definitely did. And we know from the Bar Kokhba letters that they were constantly concerned with making sure they had their ritual items and all the things that they needed in order to do the mitzvos. We have a letter in the Dead Sea Scrolls from Bar Kokhba to the community in the area of Qumran looking for esrogim, because they had to have esrogim because they had to do sukkahs. They had to have arba minim. They wanted to make sure that they could shake the lulav. These were frum guys. Okay? If a king should rise from the house of David, who is versed in Torah and engages in commandments, as did David his forefather, in accordance with both the written and oral Torahs, which clearly Bar Kokhba was doing because he couldn't have had Rabbi Akiva's support otherwise. And he enjoins all of Israel to follow in his ways and encourages them to repair its breaches. All right, so he creates a halakhic state, basically. And he fights the wars of God, which in this case was fighting against the Romans. Then he may be presumed to be the Messiah, because these are all the things that Bar Kokhba did successfully. If he succeeds in his efforts and defeats the enemies around and builds the sanctuary in its proper place, I'll explain that in a moment as well. Okay, so if he does, he defeats the enemies around, which Bar Kokhba did not do, and build the sanctuary in its proper place, which Bar Kokhba never even tried to do. He built a platform and it was an area to work, but they never tried to build the heichal and put things in their proper place. And gathers the dispersed of Israel, which didn't happen during Bar Kokhba necessarily Israel. Most people were still left outside of Israel. Some fighters came, it's very good. So then he's definitely the Messiah. Basically, what Maimonides is doing here is he's saying the stuff that, these are the things that, all these things have to happen to know that it's the Messiah. Okay? But the stuff that Bar Kokhba did, that gets you already into the Chezkas Mashiach. You can be assumed to be the Mashiach. Very good. Which is why Rabbi Akiva and everybody followed him. And they were reasonable to follow him. The other stuff that Bar Kokhba wasn't successful at is in the list of things that the Messiah really should have done and will do. But unfortunately, Bar Kokhba didn't get those things done. And that's where Rabbi Akiva and everybody else, you see, they were going with the chazakah. They were going with the presumption, the legal presumption that he was the Messiah. And unfortunately for them, let's just read a little bit further. But if he does not succeed in these matters or is killed, we will know that he was not the one the Torah has promised. He is to be merely to be considered like all the other exemplary and qualified kings of the house of David who have died. God set him up only to try the masses, as it says, and some of the wise will stumble to refine among them, to purify, etc., etc. Basically, God set the situation up. If it turns out that somebody comes and he rabble-rag, gets everybody excited that he's the Messiah, and it turns out it was a false Messiah, that God just tests people. It's like a way of God testing people. We should keep in mind that there were an awful lot of false messiahs out there over time. We gave a class about this once before. There were many, many false messiahs across the ages, not the least of which during Maimonides' time. As a matter of fact, there was somebody in Yemen at the time of Maimonides who claimed to be the Messiah, and Maimonides in Yemen, they communicated back and forth. We have these letters. They communicated back and forth about this issue. So false messiahs, let alone Christianity and Islam, which is built on Christianity, the false messiahs were something that he certainly wanted to address. Now, we are going to give you a little teaser for next week. We're just going to look here. Even Jesus the Nazarene, let's stop here. Next week, we're going to take a look at these selections. And we're going to have to do a little scholarly work and understand the scholarly background of this selection. It's in here. And we're going to see that Maimonides has a very, very, very interesting ideas about, some very interesting ideas about the way that the future correction of the world religiously will happen. But that's for next time. So next week, God willing, we'll be back again. We'll continue studying these two chapters. If you want to do a spoiler, do a spoiler, and you can read the two chapters yourself. It's Mishnah Torah, Kings and Wars, 11 and 12. You can read it on Sefaria.com anytime that you would like. Otherwise, in the absence of questions on Facebook and in the absence of any hands going up, we are going to call it a day. And I look forward to being with you next Tuesday night as we continue to examine the question of the Messiah and the coming of the Messiah and different opinions about the coming of the Messiah. Next week, we will also have opportunity to touch on the question, the very important question in our time, the very controversial question in our time of the messianic status of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's for next week. Everybody have a good week. Take care. Enjoy.